Thanks very much, Kerry. Now, the essence of the book, Farewell Dear People, stems from the way Australians have thought about the devastating impact of World War I. At the start of the war, in 1914, our national population was less than 5 million. The effect of 60,000 dead and all the maimed was obviously catastrophic, as the word Kerry used in her introduction. It is hardly surprising then that evaluation of the consequences of World War I for Australia over the ensuing decades has tended to focus on the collective impact of all those casualties. Now, this is, after all, appropriately democratic and consistent with our egalitarian traditions. That there must have been exceptionally talented individuals among the 60,000 dead has been implicitly understood. But do we know today who they were? No, we don't. Do we know their stories? What made them special? No, we don't. Unless you've already had a look at this book. If you asked informed readers in England about Britain's lost generation of World War I, a significant proportion would say, yes, you mean Rupert Brooke and Raymond Asquith and so on. But do we know our equivalents here, our Rupert Brookes? No, we don't. No, we don't. Now, the aim of this book has been to remedy this substantial deficiency in the national story. The book covers 10 Australians of rare potential who died during the war. They had outstanding pre-war achievements and outstanding character. They came from a variety of backgrounds, geographically as well as socially, some affluent and some decidedly not, and they distinguished themselves in a range of spheres. For each of these remarkable Australians, I've written an extended biography so that the reader will know them well, will appreciate why they were special, and will understand why their premature deaths were a profound loss for Australia, as well as for their families and communities. I'll be saying something about each of them today. Now, this is Jeff Mcbride, a budding architect who was a product of Melbourne's best-known creative dynasty. Just lost the I'm too loud.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. No, we just want it to remain as it was, and they'll turn it down a little bit over there. Yeah. Now, this is Jeff Mcbride, a budding architect who was a product of Melbourne's best-known creative dynasty. His grandmother was Georgiana Mcbride. Jeff combined his family's flair for writing and drawing with an endearing personality and a strong sense of right and wrong. He hated war, and he yearned to be home with his family and his girlfriend. But as long as this ghastly war continued, he felt that his duty was to play his part in it, and this was no small part. He was a battalion commander at an unusually young age. Women adored him. Sometimes when I put that image up and the gender balance is pronouncedly female, I can get this wave coming back at me. I can understand why women adored him, says the feedback. Now, Jeff inherited the classical features of his father, George. Jeff had a handsome face and an impressive physique. He was 6 feet tall at a time when this was not common. His eldest niece maintained throughout her long life that Jeff was the most handsome man she ever saw. Attractive women were attracted to Jeff, but by August 1914, he only had eyes for one. Her name was Maud. Maud Richards of Camberwell. And during the war, he missed her terribly. He wrote about her with the most poignant longing. Take, for example, this sentence he just dashed off in his diary. I feel very weary, but do not sleep, and long for the touch of a vanished hand. Oh. Before the landing at Gallipoli, Jeff participated in months of arduous training in Egypt. The one break in this gruelling routine occurred when Jeff's battalion was one of 2 AIF units dispatched to Ismailia after Turkish soldiers attacked the Suez Canal. And Jeff, like everyone else in his battalion, including the commander, Pompey Elliot, journeyed to Ismailia full of expectancy at the prospect of real fighting at last after all their strenuous training. But it proved an immense anticlimax. They had days of suspense when they heard and saw distant shell fire, but they did not fire a single shot themselves. Jeff described it as a great disappointment. But it did enable a humorist in his company to compose a limerick. There were some troops from Australia who were sent to a place called Ismailia. The whole way through they fed them on stew and the trip was a horrible failure. Jeff was wounded in his arm in the early fighting at Gallipoli, as you can see there. The title of my book, Farewell Dear People, comes from the remarkable final letter that Jeff Mcbride wrote home to his family on the 19th of July 1916. Who knows what that date means? Fromelles. This is the Battle of Fromelles, which began later that day and remains the worst 24 hours in Australia's entire history. 5,533 Australian casualties in one night. Now what Jeff wrote in the quick letter he dashed off to his family was this, and what I'm about to read is the whole letter. Today I lead my battalion in an assault on the German lines, and I pray to God I may come through all right and bring honour to our name. If not, I will at least have laid down my life for you and my country, which is the greatest privilege one can ask for. Farewell, dear people. The hour approacheth. And a few hours later, Jeff was dead. Jeff was the youngest of 6 in his family. His father, George, was a noted poet who also wrote prose and liked sketching. Jeff and George were particularly close. Jeff's older brother, Hugh, this is Hugh Mcbride, might also ring bells, yeah? Jeff's older brother, Hugh, a well-known poet, artist and cartoonist, who moved to Sydney while Jeff was still young and didn't see much of Jeff afterwards, carried with him for years an image of tall George and small Jeff happily together with their fingers intertwined. Now George, Jeff's father, was 83 when Jeff died in 1916. George's full life of personal and intellectual fulfilment contrasted with the abbreviated span of his youngest son. But in 1916, George still had another decade and more of alert life ahead of him. He devoted much of it to commemorating Jeff. This obsessive devotion reflected the intensity of the father's never-ending grief. It was as if he could in some way maintain the connection of those intertwined fingers by turning Jeff's bedroom into a perpetual shrine, by cherishing his medals and mementos, by installing a memorial window at their local church in Hawthorne, by compiling commemorative verse, by seeking his personal effects, by sketching his faraway grave, by locating the cemetery site, by pursuing posthumous awards, and by spending hours and hours transcribing Jeff's wartime diary and letters, even re-sketching the accompanying drawings. George's poems about Jeff were poignant and moving. There was one he simply called Jeff. I have a picture all my own that lights with joy my chamber wall, and here I never feel alone. His smiles our mingled days recall. He'll never die, nor yet grow old. Eternal boyhood sets its seal on these bright features, pure as bold, our own, our gallant boy and Leal. Now when I first read that I was very moved, obviously, but also a bit puzzled by the last word. Leal, L-E-A-L, I looked it up in the dictionary and found it's a Scottish word meaning loyal and faithful. Our own, our gallant boy and Leal. It's a pretty handy word to have in your repertoire when you want something to rhyme with seal. So that's Jeff. That's Jeff. Now this is an internationally, so all of these men have national significance. That's the idea of the book. They've got national significance in one way or another. But this chap had international significance. He was a marvel. The Forey or McFarlane Burnett or Gus Nossel that Australia missed out on because he was fatally wounded in the first weeks of Gallipoli while serving as a battalion doctor. Anyone heard of Clunes Matheson? Yeah, there's something there. But he was the first, he was appointed the inaugural director of Weehai. But he never took up the position because he died of Gallipoli. And he may, in my view, he probably was unaware that he'd ever been appointed. And Weehai, in the commemorations 2015, did a terrific job with Clunes. They commissioned a statue of him, which is out the front of the building, etc. Now, Clunes Matheson was born and educated in Victoria, and he received the most glowing accolades from medical scientists of the highest international renown. The director of the Lister Institute in London remarked that no man I have ever known possesses the genius for research so highly as Matheson. Another esteemed British professor wrote after Matheson's death that for the science of medicine throughout the world, the loss is irreparable. The young Australian, born I think at a place, whatever's in the books, right, but from memory it's Poverty Gully, not far from Stanley, which is a bit out from Beechworth. Yeah. For the science of medicine throughout the world, the loss is irreparable. The London Times History of the War lamented Matheson's death as the loss of a life which had been judged infinitely precious. Now, a striking thing about Matheson is that he was a revered personality as well as a renowned researcher. Someone who knew him well at this university put it this way: of Dr. Matheson as a scientist, let others speak. I speak of him as a friend, and as a friend, he was wonderful. He never flagged. The variety of his interests was remarkable. I've been with him on all sorts of occasions: yarning, cricketing, camping, canoeing, fishing, ski running, and it was always the same, whether it was a question of scientific knowledge, or of academic diplomacy, or the value of a book, or a picture, or a piece of music, or the fastening of a ski binding. It was always, ask Matthew. His cheery, chubby figure was welcome everywhere. He knew every professor and every policeman in London, and was equally at home hobnobbing with either. Now, I've got here a couple of photos of him at Caulfield Grammar. In each one, he's the little bloke sitting at the front on the right. Remarkable photo, this one. The little bloke sitting at the front on the right. Once again, the little bloke sitting at the front on the right. Now, it must have been after he left school that he became a bit chubby. Not much of him there. And after the book came out, I was contacted by the extremely capable and helpful curator of the Melbourne Uni Medical Museum, who told me she was a bit excited. She found a new photo she was previously unaware of a group photo of Matthew's uni class. And so there were 2 or 3 dozen of them. And where was Matthew? Sitting at the front on the right. Matheson's parents were both school teachers and widely admired. They had 6 children, but Clunes was the only one to reach the age of 10. As well, his father died painfully at home of illness when Clunes was 12. He clearly experienced a great deal of death and suffering in his family during his childhood. Considering that he had such wide-ranging interests across the humanities as well as the sciences, the conclusion seems inescapable that the sickness and sadness around him as he grew up influenced his decision to pursue a career as a researcher of medical science. Essentially, what he felt driven to do was to make scientific discoveries that would help sick people get better. Australia was deprived of this unique, precious genius in a deplorable way. He died while the 2nd Australian Brigade, Matthew's the battalion doctor of the 5th Battalion, Victorian unit, he died while the 2nd Australian Brigade, all Victorian battalions, was temporarily transferred to Hellies. So Anzacs landed at Anzac Cove, we all know that, but the British landed concurrently down at Hellies. And shortly after both those landings, it was decided that a formation was needed from Anzac to go down south to Hellies and give things a bit of a boost there. And that was the 2nd Australian Brigade of Victorians that was temporarily transferred down there, where they came under the command of a singularly inept British commander named General Hunter Weston. What Hunter Weston directed these Victorians to do on the 8th of May 1915 was to charge towards the little village of Krithia for 3 miles along an exposed spur in broad daylight against the same Turkish machine guns and riflemen who had halted a series of similar attacks before any of them had progressed one-sixth of that distance. Idiot. I heard the word idiot, but I'm happy to go along with that. The Victorians charged with the utmost gallantry. Onlookers likened it to the legendary charge of the Lake Brigade, but casualties were inevitably severe. Matheson tended the many wounded with exceptional bravery and selflessness. Matthew made it known that wherever I'm wanted, just tell me and I'll try to go. The historian of Matheson's unit recorded that when it became known that a Turkish bullet had found Matheson, the news depressed the whole battalion. In 1953, almost 40 years after Matheson's death, McFarlane Burnett described him as an Australian equivalent of Rupert Brooke. This is Robert Beige. Anyone heard of him?
Yes.
Yes.
Read the book.
Good on you. Now this my lovely colleague here is about to take over and do the second half. Robert Beige was a talented engineer, top degree from this university. Beige became a senior colleague of Mawson's at Antarctica and performed outstandingly there, but he's another who's long forgotten. Mawson's expeditioners happened to base themselves at the windiest place on the planet. Here are some of them in their hut, with Beige on the far left, attached to his pipe, as so often. Looking on as Frank Hurley, the famous photographer, cuts the hair and beard of John Hunter. Now, Hunter was a scientist from Sydney who did not know Beige before their time together at Antarctica. Beige, of course, from this university, he's from Melbourne. Now, Hunter quickly developed a very high regard for Beige. What Hunter wrote about Beige in his diary was this: Bob Beige is the best liked man on the expedition, and personally I think he's the best man we have. He's an untiring worker, ever ready to help anybody. Personally, he is a fine fellow, and of jovial spirit and smiling countenance. There's no one that I have met that I have greater respect for than Bob. In fact, he's an ideal fellow, and I hope our friendship will long continue. So that's quite an accolade for someone he's only just met, isn't it? Now, after they had endured months of ferocious blizzards cooped up in their hut, Mawson arranged for his men to embark on various exploring operations, and he placed Beige in charge of a particularly daunting sledging expedition. Beige and his two colleagues, Frank Hurley was one, and he took this photo. Beige and his two colleagues ventured more than 300 miles south across rough terrain where no one had ever been before, despite encountering the most violent hurricanes. In this photo, Beige is on the right reading their sledge meter to check how far they'd come. He and his comrades were then 278 miles south of their hut. Along the way they made regular geographical, meteorological and magnetic measurements because they were exploring for scientific research. They were in fact not far from the South Pole, but as far as they were concerned, this was not a superficial exercise for getting to some target just for what they saw, as the shallow glory of being the first to plonk a flag there. They were doing it for scientific research. It was an exceedingly dangerous expedition, and Beige and his comrades only just managed to survive their harrowing return journey. But their remarkable feat was well known at the time, and it's completely unknown now. Almost completely unknown now. All the sledging expeditions returned to the hut that was the home base of Mawson's men within a couple of days of Mawson's stipulated deadline, except one. And that was the three-man party led by Mawson himself. The ship that was to take all the expeditioners back to Australia, called the Aurora, had arrived with its irascible captain, J.K. Davis. He was known as Gloomy Davis, but his concern about delay was understandable as ships had limited seasonal scope to manoeuvre in these icy waters. Several days later, with Gloomy Davis increasingly tense and still no sign of Mawson, 6 expeditioners, including Beige, were selected to stay on for another winter in case Mawson's party belatedly turned up. Eventually, Gloomy Davis decided he couldn't wait anymore, and the Aurora departed, only for Mawson to materialise later that very same day in an emaciated state with the harrowing news that the 2 comrades with him had died. As if this wasn't dramatic enough, when they managed to send a wireless message to the Aurora asking for it to return, which it did, with great reluctance from Gloomy Davis, the sea was too wild for Mawson, Beige and the others to be collected. So they're waiting on the shore, knowing that Gloomy Davis would be increasingly agitated about this further delay. So the Aurora's out off the coast, they're perched on the shore, and they're trying to get a little boat in to retrieve them, but the water's too rough, the sea's too rough. In the end, Gloomy decided he could linger no longer, and the Aurora departed again. So the hopes of Beige and his shore-based companions were shattered. They had to endure another year of isolation and limited amenities, and unvaried food, and apocalyptic weather, and no women, before they could be collected. And as soon as the surprise further drained morale when one of them went mad, Beige became wary of even conversing in the hut, as this troubled colleague would bizarrely misinterpret even the most innocuous remarks. Now, when the Aurora reappeared all those months later, in December 1913, the jubilation ashore was understandably intense. Beige and his companions really were going home this time. Their arrival in Australia was a celebrated event. This is a photo again taken by Frank Hurley. Bob Beige on his way home after more than 2 years of outstanding service to Australia and Antarctica. It's a great photo. Only a year later, though, he was killed in the first fortnight of Gallipoli. And what happened was this. Beige was the deputy leader of one of the original companies of engineers. He landed with his company on the original Anzac Day. During the chaos of the first few days ashore, Beige and his men did the kind of things that engineers did. They widened roads, strengthened trenches, constructed loopholes, excavated emplacements for the artillery, and so on. Beige spent the morning of the 7th May surveying. This is the day before the charge of Pripyat down south in the Galleys. Beige spent the morning of the 7th May surveying. The young men with him paused for a bit of lunch. Beige strolled to the adjacent AIF position, perhaps intent on getting something to eat there himself. Now, as it happened, the commander of the AIF's 1st Division, Major General Bridges, was there. Bridges had been appraising the tactical options in the local area, and he'd just come to a decision about what he wanted. When Beige materialised along the trench, Bridges blurted out, "He is the man!" Now, Beige was startled. He wasn't used to being addressed in such fashion by a Major General. But then he found out why he was the man, and he became seriously perturbed. Bridges had decided that he wanted the infantry in the local area to occupy a forward post, and he wanted a reliable engineer to mark out the position beforehand, so that the infantry would know exactly where Bridges wanted them to dig in. And Beige, of course, fitted the description reliable engineer perfectly, which was why Bridges had blurted out, "He is the man." But this would involve Beige venturing out 150 yards in front of the then Anzac position and banging in some marker pegs in view of the Turks, and Bridges wanted this done straight away. Beige respectfully pointed out that this would be a very risky undertaking, and the best chance of carrying it out effectively would be to do it at night. But Bridges was adamant. He wanted it done that afternoon, that is, in broad daylight, full view of the Turks. Beige was a loyal officer. He knew that an order was an order. Beige was also a highly capable and insightful officer. He was well aware that his prospects of surviving such a venture were slim. He resigned himself to his probable fate and even arranged for the dispersal of his belongings. Bob Beige did his utmost to carry out the task. He was hammering in a marker peg where Bridges wanted when he was killed by a fusillade of fire from umpteen Turkish riflemen and at least 5 machine guns. Yeah. Australians have tended to be critical of incompetent British generals whose ineptitude led to the deaths of regrettably many Australians, and understandably critical in the case of commanders like General Haking, who was culpable for the death of Jeff Mcbride and thousands of others at Fromell in the worst 24 hours in Australian history, and also General Hunter Weston, who was culpable for the appalling fiasco at Krithia that resulted in the death of the irreplaceable Cleves Matheson. But what happened to Bob Beige at Gallipoli on the 7th May 1915, when his life was cavalierly imperilled by General Bridges, and he predictably died, confirms that inept decisions by generals that led to the deaths of Australians with the most outstanding potential for future greatness were made, in some instances, by Australian commanders as well as by British ones. This is an exceptionally talented soldier from a working class background in Sydney named Tom Elliot. He was part of the second intake at Duntroon, which entered the college in 1912 after a series of competitive exams. There were more than 100 applicants from around Australia, and Tom Elliot of Marrickville ended up with the highest marks of all. Here he is on the left in a close finish at an athletics meeting at Duntroon. No, track the chocolate too. This is the Duntroon rugby team with Tom third from right in the back row. Now this Duntroon side was unbeaten for years, and some experts felt that there was no finer team in Australia apart from the national side. 5 of these players, 1/3 of the team, died in World War I. Of the 10 who survived, at least half became Major Generals or even better. So the strong presumption is that of the 5 who died, there is serious talent there as well. Certainly the case with Tom. Now in 1916, Tom became an officer in the 60th Battalion, which was part of Pompey Elliot's, no relation, 15th Brigade. Pompey knew Tom for only 4 months, but in that time formed the view that Tom was the finest natural soldier he had ever met, and an officer of immense potential who'd be crucial to Australia's future. Pompey kept describing Tom as potentially an Australian Kitchener, which was an extraordinary accolade in the context of Kitchener's immense prestige in 1916. And having written a couple of books now on Pompey, I can assure you that he was not one to throw around compliments lightly. If he said Tom was very special, Tom was very, very special indeed. Now, when Pompey concluded correctly that the proposed attack at Fromelles would prove a disaster, he tried to persuade his superiors to cancel it. When this attempt did not succeed, Pompey tried to keep Tom out of the battle because he was so precious to Australia's future. Tom ended up participating in Fromelles and he was killed. A big focus of the book is the dual impact of the loss of these special Australians I've written about. But they were a big loss to Australia as well as to their families. And this is certainly the case with Tom Elliot. But the upshot within his family was catastrophic. His mother, Mary, could not accept Tom's death. The mixed official messages she received were influential. First, she was told officially that he'd been wounded, then told officially that he was missing, and only later told officially that he'd been killed. She kept pressing the authorities for clarification of what she understandably concluded was implicit uncertainty. It is an awful thing to leave a mother in doubt. The suspense is dreadful, she told me. She resorted to alcohol to help her cope, and then began to have delusions about Tom. Eventually, she was placed in an asylum for the insane. She died there of Spanish flu in mid-1919. As Kerry said in the introduction, Spanish flu was very pronounced and severe in Australia. 3 of Tom's younger brothers enlisted, one at the age of 15. All of these 3 soldiers were wounded, and one of them died also in 1919. And there's a great deal in this book about loss, including the effect on fathers and brothers, but particularly on women, mothers, wives, fiancées, girlfriends, sisters. There's another biography in the book of someone from a Sydney working class background with a rugby connection who's long forgotten and very little known today. His name is Edward Larkin, and here he is on the far left in this photo of the Australian rugby team in 1903. Later, Ted became the key figure in the rise to prominence of the breakaway code of rugby league, which became the leading winter sport in Sydney and beyond while Larkin was running it. And then in 1913, Ted Larkin pulled off an upset at the New South Wales state election by winning the seat of Willoughby as the Labor candidate. Now, for those of you not 100% familiar, Sydney urban geography, Willoughby is in the region called the Lower North Shore, yeah, which has never been, not today, certainly not then, promising territory for the Labor Party. So this was a big upset that Ted Larkin's pulled off. And he proceeded to make a highly impressive start in Parliament. And he was certainly a lot more impressive than another Labor newcomer who entered the New South Wales Parliament after that same 1913 state election. This other chap was a little-known estate agent named... No, not Billy Hughes. Jack Lang is correct. Well played. Yep. Well played. Now, before long, political pundits were predicting a big future for Larkin. They certainly weren't saying that about Jack Lang. In his early months as an MP, they weren't saying, oh, this bloke's a future leader. But they were saying that about Larkin. Some were even seeing him already as a future Premier. But then the Great War began, and Larkin, who's on the left here, enlisted in the first rush, and he died in the first rush on the original Anzac Day. He left a grieving widow and 2 little boys. Larkin was particularly devoted to his family, and not particularly devoted to the military. He had attained prominence and success through determination and toil, and bigger and better things were not far away. All this, however, Ted Larkin relinquished, reluctantly, with no illusions. He was well aware he was taking a big risk, because he conceived it as his duty, by virtue of his prominence, initially in sporting circles and more recently as an MP, to set an example for footballers and other sportsmen to follow. That is, he volunteered primarily to encourage others to enlist. Larkin is commemorated in a plaque on the wall of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. It was unveiled at this moving ceremony in November 1915. The plaque is still there today, on the wall in the parliamentary chamber, though hardly anyone today knows about Ted Larkin. Now, having covered a couple of Sydney-siders with rugby connections, it's time to switch to Australian rules. Now, this is George Chalice, a brilliant Aussie rules footballer who was recruited from Tasmania by Carlton. This is a flashback to Jack Elliott, who I'm no fan of. Chalice played 4 splendid seasons with the Blues before he went away to war and became another very special Australian to be killed at Fromell. My biography of Chalice covers his upbringing and education at the tiny hamlet of Cleveland and then Launceston. It covers how he came to be recruited by Carlton, how he became a revered star for the Blues, how the way the game was played at that time differed from today. No kicking backwards, no handball in the back line, play it like that then. And how the fierce rivalries between Carlton and Collingwood, and between Carlton and Essendon, which is so alive and well today, were initiated in the era just before World War I. When people think Carlton and Collingwood have been enemies forever. Not so. Not so. There was a particular match that started the hostility just before World War I, and of course it's all in the book. George Chalice is on the right here with his close friend and teammate at both Launceston and Carlton, Viv Valentine, who later coached Carlton. Chalice's most dazzling performance in his first VFL season, 1912, was against Carlton's bitter rivals from Essendon. The big crowd was captivated by his pace and grace. The typical Carlton supporter of that era was described, and I'm quoting here from the Football Record, so it's got to be right, as barracking with a voice like that of a man who has swallowed the claw of his crayfish in the Boozers Express at midnight. Now, be that as it may, the Carlton fans were ecstatic on that memorable day when a reporter wrote this about Chalice. He played like a champion against Essendon, pulled himself out of tight corners, swung the ball into position, measuring his kicks almost to the inch. He was superb. Excuse me. He was superb. And if there was a cup for the best player on the ground, Chalice would have won the Chalice. Now, that's his gag, which I've incorporated. But it's all in the book. Yeah, that's in the book too. But you can't run the game. But also in that quote, were the words "almost to the inch." Now, there's the confirmation for those of us who are lamenting the departure of Dennis Cometti's AFL commentary, that 100 years ago they were talking about the pre-metric equivalent of centimetre perfect. This is Carew Rennell, a South Australian winemaker. Carew began managing his family's winery at Ranella when he was only about 19 and used the latest scientific techniques to good effect. He was a visionary vigneron and a highly successful one. He was a widely admired community leader as well. Carew was renowned as a horse rider of exceptional dash and fearlessness. He became commander of a light horse regiment in the AIF and displayed energetic and irrepressible leadership in a series of engagements at Gallipoli. He was a highly capable and widely admired commander. He was also compassionate to wounded Turks. After a particular Turkish attack was rebuffed, Carew involved himself in the risky rescuing of wounded Turks. This led to a friendship with another rescuer, an intriguing character named Audrey Herbert. Anyone besides here heard of Audrey Herbert?
No.
Audrey Herbert, in 1915, was a 35-year-old British officer on General Goldie's staff. Of aristocratic background, he was adventurous, chivalrous, a Conservative MP, and practically blind. He had an eccentric, unsoldierly manner, perhaps because he couldn't see a great deal, but was uniquely useful in intelligence because he was fluent in 7 languages other than English, and he knew a great deal about Turkey. Carew quickly developed a friendly affinity with Audrey Herbert, and they agreed to travel in Europe together after the war. But in August 1915, Carew was killed, leading his men forward in an attack at Hill 60, Gallipoli. Audrey Herbert was dismayed to hear about the death of his friend who, as Audrey said, was worshipped by his men. He wrote a poem in tribute to Carew. I'd just like to read you a little bit of it. So this is the eccentric Englishman writing about his new friend, the Australian winemaker from South Australia, Carew. You left your vineyards dreaming of the vines in a dreamland and dim Italian cities where high cathedrals stand. At Anzac in the evening, so many things we planned, and now you sleep with comrades in the Anafarta sand. You lived for peace and lived for war. You knew no little strife. To conquer first, then help your foe, made music of your life. And for the sake of those you led, you gave your life away, as youth might fling a coin of gold upon a sunny day. You'd find a bridge to Lazarus or any man in pain. There are not many like you that I shall see again. I do not grieve for you who laughed and went into the shade. I sorrow for the dream that's lost, Italian plans we made. Goodbye, it's Armageddon. You will not prune your vine, nor taste the salt of channel winds, nor hear the singing Rhine. You'll sleep with friends and enemies until the trumpet sounds, and open are the thrones of kings and all the Trojan mounds. So he clearly thought a great deal of Carew, didn't he? Now, when Carew's death was announced in the South Australian papers, an admirer was moved to write a stirring letter describing Carew as an Australian equivalent of Rupert Brooke. Carew left a widow and a little boy and girl. Here he is at Ranella with his children just before he went away to war. The little boy you can see on the left grew up to become a brilliant pilot, and early in the Battle of Britain he was shot down and killed. For almost all of you, the names and the stories in Farewell Dear People won't be familiar. However, this bloke is one of the 10, and I'm sure that everyone here knows something about him. I don't think you'll know who he is unless you've read what I've written about him. But you do know something about him even though you don't know that you know it. Now, to explain, I need to take you back to the 1970s when there was a talented Australian who yearned to create a special, gripping story about Gallipoli. He'd been grappling with this project for years. He had read Charles Bean's Official History. He had visited Anzac Cove and traversed the trenches at a time when not many did. He had tossed around plenty of ideas, various angles, numerous drafts, but none had proved ultimately satisfying. None was compelling enough for what he was trying to do. And then one day, he happened to read Charles Bean's history again, and in particular a sentence about someone who was last seen running forward like a schoolboy in a foot race. So I'll start again. Who was last seen running forward like a schoolboy in a foot race with all the speed he could compass. Unquote. Now the potential of that sentence jumped out at him. It suddenly occurred to him that here was the way to shape his story. Now the name of the talented Australian who had an exhilarating breakthrough, an epiphany, when he read that sentence is, as some of you may have realised, no. Someone said the name here. Peter Weir. I'm hearing low level mumbling, but it is Peter Weir. Peter Weir, who went on to make his celebrated film Gallipoli. Now Peter Weir's name is pretty well known, but the man he had read about, the light horseman, who was last seen running forward like a schoolboy in a foot race, is hardly known at all. That's him there. His name is Wilfred Harper. Wilfred Harper's story has never been told until this book. A small number of experts are aware that the sentence about Wilfred in Charles Bean's history was the inspiration for Peter Weir's film, but few even of them know anything about Wilfred other than that sentence about how he died. Now, having highlighted the connection, I should make clear that the character in the film, you remember the fair-haired chap who was called in the film Archie Hamilton, who was played by Mark Lee. Archie Hamilton is not Wilfred. Gallipoli is a feature film, it's not a documentary. It is true that Wilfred and Archie were both from WA, both had a farming background, both were in the 10th Light Horse, and both died in the charge at the Neck, and in the same way. However, there were significant differences. Archie's younger than Wilfred. Also, Archie was a reinforcement who arrived at Gallipoli just before the August offensive, whereas Wilfred was a 10th Light Horse original who'd been at Gallipoli since May. As well, Archie, as you'll remember from the film, was a top-class sprinter, whereas Wilfred's interests and talents lay more in cricket and football than in athletics. Here's Wilfred in the 1908 photo of his school cricket team. He's in the centre of the middle row as captain, best batsman and best bowler. So, Archie in the Gallipoli film is not Wilfred Harper, although the manner of Wilfred's death was certainly the inspiration for the film. Wilfred had a notable brother in the 10th Light Horse, Gresley Harper. He was also killed in charge of the Neck. Now, Gres Harper, a barrister with a vivid personality, had a brilliant career ahead of him in the law and or politics, and the story of his life has never been written before either. Gres was amiable and convivial. He had heaps of friends and amused them with his quick wit and rapier repartee. Now, it's of course not possible to reel off a series of examples in a talk like this due to the time constraints, which I'm perhaps already extending. But one brief sentence can perhaps give you a flavour. When Gresley's troopship, on its way, and Wilfred's, Gresley and Wilfred's troopship, on its way to Egypt, stopped briefly at Colombo, and Gres knew that mention of this in letters home was banned under the censorship that officers enforced by checking the men's letters. He referred to it in his next letter to his mother like this. Where we landed is of course a profound secret which you are not considered a fit person to hold. Take that, Mum. Now, I've got one more page. Keep going. Yeah. So, Gres was instrumental. This is a remarkable anecdote. I'd be ashamed to miss this out. Gres was instrumental in one of the most remarkable incidents of the whole Gallipoli campaign. It happened in May 1915, when he was among a party of light horsemen who were directed to capture a crater from the Turks at Quinn's Post. Now, Quinn's was the precarious apex of the area the Anzacs occupied. Overlooked, this shows you why, partly why it was precarious, overlooked by the Turks from the right, from the left, and the left rear. Now, overnight the Turks came forward and in the narrow belt of no man's land that Quins, they occupied a crater. And the chiefs, senior officers at the position there decided that they can't be allowed to do that. So that they hadn't occupied a crater. This is why I shouldn't ad lib. A crater had appeared, a crater had emerged overnight, and our officers decided that we should occupy it. So the light horsemen, as ordered, charged the crater and succeeded in capturing it, with the Turks who'd been occupying, so they were occupying, the Turks who'd been occupying it either killed or driven out of it. But the key point is here, this one, with one exception, a Turk who was wounded in the skirmish and couldn't get away. But Grez and his comrades soon realised that they themselves were trapped in the crater. The enemy front line was nearby, and the Turks kept shooting at the crater and lobbing bombs into it. The Australians had no bombs left, and the Turks had plenty. Moreover, it was an oppressively hot day, and the light horsemen had limited water. They had a tense, gruelling ordeal for hours, perpetually on edge in case a bomb landed in the crater, and they had to throw it back before it exploded. Those with cricket experience, including Grez, proved very handy at this. Key point here, even in these dire circumstances, Grez Harper's humanitarian instincts prevailed. He befriended the wounded Turk who was stuck in the crater with them. Grez fixed up his wound for him and gave him some of the Anzac rations. The upshot was a startling development. Eventually, a group of Turks charged the crater to regain it, and the Australian light horsemen, including Grez, had no option but to scramble back to their front line. When one of them slipped and fell back into the crater, this was not Grez, one of his comrades, 3 bold Turks rushed forward and captured him. The wounded Turk, who was Grez Harper's new friend, a bystander up to this point, then made an astonishing intervention. He picked up a discarded rifle, shot 2 of these Turkish captors, his own countrymen, and grappled with the third, enabling the vulnerable Australian to escape. And ensuring his own death, of course, as other Turks coming up behind saw what had happened. But pretty soon, the astounding story of the Turk who swapped sides swept through the AIF and reached even the inner circle of King George in England. And the King was pretty chuffed to hear about that sequence of events. In this photo of the Harper brothers and their father, Grez is seated on the left, and Wilfred, as the youngest of the brothers, is reclining in front. This photo of Grez and Wilf in Egypt with the 2 comrades of their light horse section was taken exactly a week before the Gallipoli landing. Now, I came to the Harpers relatively late in the piece when it occurred to me that a book like this on Australia's lost generation should contain coverage of the Western Australians at the neck. I then discovered that there was another member of the 10th Light Horse who had exceptional promise, Phipps Turnbull, who was also killed in the charge at the neck. Now, he's the last of the 10, so we're very nearly finished. Thank you for your patience. Here's Phipps. After a brilliant scholastic and sporting career, Phipps was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship and became the 4th Rhodes Scholar from WA. He proceeded to Oxford University and emerged with an outstanding degree. In his year, 60 candidates attained final honours in jurisprudence, but only 3 of them were awarded first-class honours. Turnbull was among the 3. Clearly an exceptional accomplishment. Phipps combined widely admired character and personality with academic attainments of the highest distinction. A shining future for Phipps Turnbull in the law and or politics was an absolute certainty. Here he is with his fiancée Molly Marmion, who was a fine writer and wrote very movingly about her grief after Phipps died. I've quoted her in the book, of course. Now, in conclusion, some general remarks, very, very briefly. During the years I was researching and writing this book, I was asked, as historians, indeed all writers, often are, what project I was working on. Now, when I explained what this book was about, I was struck by the reaction. The idea of the book, Farewell Dear People, seemed to strike a strongly favourable response, much more so than I've experienced with any of my previous books when I was asked that question and answered it. Naturally, I hope that the execution of the task has lived up to the potential of the idea. Retrieving these forgotten lives has been an exacting research challenge. I think they're strong stories, but I'm hopelessly biased, so what I think about that doesn't matter at all. What does matter to me is this. Now that these men and their stories have been retrieved, they should not be forgotten again. Thank you very much.